introduce. All right. Hello, everybody, and hello, everybody who's online. I hope you can hear me online. You should be able to. Thank you very much for being here. I can't remember how many seminars we've done already. This is six, I think. On worldviews, and people who read worldview today, people who've talked about worldview in the past. Today we have Ludwig with us. He came all the way from the University of Wageningen. I'll say a little bit more about this. We have a program of further seminars coming up. The next one being a roundtable on worldview education in England, the Netherlands, and Flanders in high school, the move from religious education in high schools to worldview education. And there will be more in the summer. We're still making things happen. And as always, you can find previous seminars on our YouTube page called Exploring Worldviews, where you can also find this one if you want to listen to it again. David will say more. We invited him because through Todd, we knew about his research with different communities and the relationship between indigenous people and scientists, collaborations, tense collaborations between the two, and where the question of worldview both serves to illuminate and complicate a little bit ways of understanding these relations. That's my way of understanding how we're doing. And that's particularly interesting for us because part of our project is about the way worldview is mobilized by indigenous people and indigenous activists today to make all sorts of claims about land, but also about incommensurability between their way of seeing the world, the Western way of seeing the world. So we're quite excited to have this discussion today. David will talk for about 35 minutes, and then we'll open the floor, both online and in the room. That's about it, I think.
Who wants to? We're going to go out for drinks afterwards.
And then if you're in or around Groningen, we will go for drinks. Have we decided where?
No, but you have to stick it out. And then
So,
find out the end.
exactly. So you can meet us at the faculty, and then we will go for drinks with whoever is here. With no further ado, David. Yes.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. It's been a really nice visit. We started at 12, right? Just chatting about things and having conversations from everything of like history of German philosophy, socioeconomic implications of white village in India. And so for me, that's incredibly exciting because my academic identity and work is kind of in between. On the one hand, being trained as a philosopher of science and doing very abstract stuff, and on the other hand, kind of being focused on doing community-based action research, trying to kind of make a difference on the ground together with communities, which is very practical, right? And I think that's kind of where a lot of these worldview issues come in, right? It's like already partly confusing once we're together as a bunch of people who see the world and interact with the world in different ways, and you can get lost in the philosophical questions about how to make sense of that and whether we can understand each other in the first place. And on the other hand, it's so practical. How do we get together and get things done together in a place to make a positive difference, right? And so that can, of course, lead the conversation in radically different ways, right? And sometimes I have a clear sense of, well, either I'm talking to practitioners and I'm talking about philosophy stuff. Yeah,
I think the microphones might be here. It might be in the front. No, they're very front of the room. So maybe, is it possible for you to stand up there? Can you hear okay?
This is
Yes, someone was.
They're not in the back.
Then I hide between my desk again, because then I can see what the other is. So, yeah, sometimes I have a sense of what the audience is, right? They either want me to do the philosophy stuff or they want me to do the action research stuff. It's a little bit of both, I think. So it's going to be a bit of a messy talk where I'm presenting some stuff that's more practical and some stuff that's more theoretical in different ways. But I hope that also means there's a little bit in there for everyone to be interesting. And so I thought I'm going to start by actually reading something, some field notes on from my last visit in Slovenia, which is one of the communities we work with. But no worries, I'm not going to read out my whole talk. It's just talk. And then I'm going to go into some of the more philosophical questions of how to study ontologies and in a specific space. And I kind of move towards transdisciplinary stuff, like how do we move from kind of asking these philosophical questions to trying to bring people together. Can you hear us now? I think, okay, it says this is better. So I think we're fine now, hopefully. All right. Perfect. Okay. So back to the overview. So I'm going to read a note from the field. I'm going to talk more abstractly how to study ontologies in the field. Then I kind of move towards our more action-oriented transdisciplinary ambitions. And then I go back to some kind of abstract philosophical debates that we're having sometimes in the project that I thought, if I'm already visiting a project on worldviews, I'm just going to present you the kind of discussions that we have, and then you can solve those problems for us of whether we're studying different worlds or different worldviews in these projects. Anyhow, so for the story. The background is this project, GEOS, which is short for Global Epistemologies and Ontologies. It's a project that I've been coordinating for a bit more than 5 years now. So you can see it's a relatively big team. We study local kind of interactions between communities, scientists, policymakers, all kinds of transdisciplinary engagements, while philosophically reflecting about different forms of knowledge, different worldviews, different values that clash or may complement each other when different people try to work together. And so that happens in different geographies. But the place where we've worked the longest are 2 little fishing villages called Cedebinia and Poças, which are in the state of Bahia in the northeast of Brazil. And I've been working there for 7 years. My closest collaborator, Jabal El-Hani, who's a professor of biology at the Federal University of Bahia. He's been working there for 15 years. And so we started there with a project actually mostly in education, but with more philosophical ambitions of understanding local worldviews or ontologies. While over the years, the project has really more transformed into an action research project where we try to, for example, build conservation plans, education plans, and so on together. And so to introduce you both to the project and the kind of things that we've done, I'm going to read some notes that I wrote in the last year during my visit there, and then we can kind of go back into the regular PowerPoint mode. So, the note, there's a title on loving relations in Cedebinia. What is the role of a philosopher in a small fishing village in the northeast of Brazil? When I first visited the community of Cedebinia in 2018, I thought that I had a compelling answer.
Fishers in Sardinia are experts about their complex world, from the mangrove forests to the shore of the Atlantic Oceans. Sidelined by narratives of development and modernization, the expertise of communities like Sardinia often remains invisible in academic research. Doing science differently and finding solutions together therefore requires a better understanding of local expertise and the way it is entangled with local realities. So back in 2018, it seemed to me that the task of a philosopher in Sardinia was rather straightforward. The task was to better understand local knowledge, practices, values, and worldviews, to appreciate how the community creates intricate relations with the environment, to make the case that these relations are often deeply sustainable and central to local well-being, that they should not be cast aside by academic researchers or policymakers. I'm still convinced that this, quote, field philosophy has generated valuable insights, that it has allowed us to challenge the provincialism of academic philosophy through insights that would not have emerged from the philosophical armchair. Still, the experience of doing philosophy in a fishing community has been deeply humbling. It has put a spotlight on the many limitations of our academic practices. As academics, we're usually trained to talk about people, not to talk with people. And we're even less prepared to work with people to create something valuable together. When trying to explore local epistemologies and ontologies in Sardinia, our practices inevitably mirrored our academic training, always with new methods, conducting interviews, participant observation focus groups, other events. Sometimes community members were exhausted by our questions. Sometimes they were suspicious about our intentions and what would we do with all that data. And to be completely honest, many of these suspicions were justified. Even with all of our critical reflections and good intentions, the data often still served our goals, finishing master and PhD theses, publishing articles, completing work packages of our grants, and so on. Stumbling through the interpersonal and political thickets of community-based research, new questions about relationality have emerged. The questions are not primarily about relations between the community and its environment, but increasingly become about the relations between the community and us, researchers. As researchers, we were clearly not well prepared to navigate all the complexities of these relations. Even with all the decolonial, feminist, and intercultural articles on our laptops, we still sometimes got stuck in the same extractive relations that we were so keen to criticize. Often, the community would still be positioned to provide data that advanced our academic goals and suited our interests in critical academic reflection on epistemologies and ontologies. Concerns about extractive relations between communities and researchers are reshaping our lens on relationality in Sardinia. It has become a lens that focuses on the interpersonal relations between researchers and community members, on the actions we take together to build mutual trust and care. The relations needed for succeeding in such tasks are manifold. They involve commitment, care, open and honest communication, respect, recognition, and trust. In short, they require the cultivation of loving relations. Our learning journey in Sardinia has therefore led us on an unexpected path that turns back towards us and the very ways we're doing research. Back in 2018, thinking about relations in Sardinia mostly meant studying local epistemologies and ontologies, their worldviews. Now it has transformed into a challenge for us to practice science in a more loving manner that allows for the collective cultivation of better relations. End of fieldwork notes. So, that's a bit of the context of the evolution of our work. where we started as philosophers, or at least I started as a philosopher, being interested in understanding the local worldviews and the local worlds. And it is kind of transformed into a project that highlights the transdisciplinary aspect of how do we create something together that's valuable for the community, even if we have very different worldviews, live in different worlds, which are, I think, fundamentally quite different questions, even if they're entangled with each other, right? And so that's just a picture of the community. That leads me back to the roadmap. So the second part of the talk is more the part where we started. I'm just going to walk you a little bit through our kind of partly empirical and partly philosophical approach to kind of trying to study local ontologies. And then the third part is kind of what the story highlights of where we have ended up in the project, trying to figure out how can we navigate between those worldviews, how can we navigate between those worlds in a way that actually makes a positive difference. And then I move back to philosophical theory if we still have time. Okay, so how to study ontologies. There are, of course, many different ways. But where we started was in a field called ethnotaxonomy. And so Sardinia, as you've seen, it's a community of fishers. So if you want to study the local ontologies, why not start with a fish, right? And one way of starting with a fish, and that's the most quantitative part that has happened in that project. No worries, I'm not going to bother you further with p-values and things like that. Has been to just kind of figure out what are the types of fish that exist. Like, what's the basic inventory of the stuff that exists there, right? They're basic fish ontology. And so one anthropological method to do that is called free listing. So Vitor, who was one of the PhDs on the project, is now a postdoc in Sao Paulo. He is trained as an ethnobiologist. And so he did those free listing exercises where he just went around in the community and asked people, well, tell me what kind of fish do you know, right? And so they were just kind of listing them. And so then there's kind of a bit of a calculation of, how often are they mentioned, and then are they mentioned at the beginning or at the end? And so then he came up with a list of the most salient fish, right? So that's kind of the basic elements of the fish ontology there. So that's the first step, right? Then you have the entities. What becomes more interesting then, I'm at the wrong laptop, was to kind of sort them together rather than just simply have a list. Was a method that was called triad tasks. And there, the basic idea was you would show people those pictures, right? And you would ask them basically which of them are most similar to each other, which of them belong together, right? And you would run that over and over and over to kind of figure out which of these fish are considered to belong to the same category, the same group, and so on. And then in a third step, you would have then some kind of taxonomy of the local fish and how they belong together according to the community. We would compare that to biological taxonomies, right? Do people group the fish in the same way as academic researchers do, right? Or do they structure the biological world in different ways? And it turns out, I'm not going to get too much into the details, that it's a complex result. In some cases, you find that local communities classify the biological world in ways that are strikingly similar to biological taxonomists, right? Even if their ways of kind of carving up the world into different categories has not been influenced by academic research, somehow they end up with the same categories, right? And that's, of course, more philosophically speaking, what kind of realists would expect, right? Because no matter whether it's an indigenous community or an academic researcher, they both recognize the same kind of structures in the biological world, so in the end, they kind of come up with similar categories. In other cases, they carve them up in surprisingly different ways, right? So you have categories of fish, or in that case, like in the picture also of birds, where we also did some studies, where you have a local name that does not correspond to any biological taxon, right? Because they're just kind of carved up in different ways, right? So if you, for example, categorize fish on the basis of some of the ecological roles, their tastes, where they can be found in the mangrove, you may end up coming up with categories that are very different than if you carve up the biological world according to phylogenetic data. Yeah? So that's kind of a result that may be more friendly to constructivists and philosophical terms. We think, like depending on our cultural context, we kind of create very different concepts and very different ways of categorizing the world around us. So that's some kind of pretty kind of empirics heavy and quantitatively based way of approaching ontologies, right? But I thought very interesting. At the same time, also a quite limited one, which we then encountered when we engage with a quite different way of studying ontologies through an entity that's called Kaipora. And Kaipora is one of these kind of mythical creatures. Most rural communities across Brazil and actually most of the Americas have them in one way or another. Kaipora is kind of considered a herder of wild animals, mediates encounters between humans and game. If you upset Kaipora, you get lost. That's basically the message, right? So you better don't upset Kaipora. Right? And so there's a lot of complexity going on in that story, right? I think philosophically speaking, I think one of the most interesting thing is that if you approach ontologies more through the first example that I gave, the fish classifications, it's quite clear that there's, a shared reality that we're referring to, that we're just classifying in different ways, right? And it's maybe not so surprising that, if you're an academic researcher, that's like evolutionary biologist, right? And you're interested in phylogenetic relations, you look at different properties out there, you come up with different concepts, and if you're interested in figuring out where can you find the fish, how do they taste, or what ecological roles are they, right? They're just kind of, but that doesn't, I think, call into question so much that there is a shared world, right? That both the scientists and the community refers to, they just have different interests, so they use different categories, right? It's not maybe that mysterious philosophically, right? Kaipora is quite more of a challenge for philosophers because it's not clear at all what that term refers to, right? Does Kaipora exist? Does it even make sense to ask that question, right? And so we'd look at the literature and people give very different answers, right? So for some people, it may refer to something like the leader of a pack type of animal, right? So there may be something in nature that it refers to. For others, it's just kind of a folk myth, right? I think a lot of these traditions are increasingly just treated as folkloristic in Brazil, just as, I think in Europe it's already happened, where we of course also have similar creatures from our folk books, but no one wonders about whether they're real or not. For others, it's a very kind of realist claim they are real, right? And so we did kind of more ethnographic interviews, so they the quantitative stuff doesn't really get you that far anymore. Trying to understand what are people's relations to Kaipora, and It's radically different. Some are realists about Kaipora. They're like, yeah, Kaipora is real, and if you kind of mess with them, it's also kind of unclear whether male or female. If you mess with them, you're going to be punished. And for others, it's just kind of a silly myth that of course doesn't exist, right? And for others, it's the wrong type of question to ask whether Kaipora exists, right? And so one way of, I think, how you can interpret that, and I think especially honestly, Western academics love to interpret it that way because it seems like this kind of nice kind of middle ground type of thing, is to say, well, let's not wonder whether Kaipora is real or not. Let's focus on what Kaipora does, right? And then have the story. Well, one part of a lot of these stories about Kaipora. So if you upset Kaipora, right, you get punished. And you upset Kaipora if you mistreat the forest, right? So if you kind of, for example, take more wood that you need, or you kill more animals that you need to eat, right? Then Kaipora will punish you, right? And so often, and that was one of the hypotheses that we started with, was kind of that it's part of the moral order in the community, right? Where, for example, we think about treating the forest sustainably, right? Where sustainability is a part of a very Western ontology or worldview, right? That's kind of deeply embedded in modern capitalism and commodity production, right? The idea that the environment around us is a resource system, but it's a resource system that has limited resources, so we need to manage it in a sustainable way that the resources don't get depleted, right? That's how we think about that, but that's very different from how the community thinks about it, right? For them, for example, the idea of resources that get depleted, that's very foreign, I think, also to people in Slovenia. So then the idea was that thinking about Kaipora as part of the moral order there, that kind of makes people engage with the forest more sustainably, right? Now, I think our empirical evidence is very shaky on that claim, actually, right? So it's a nice story, I think, right? But people are, like, especially older people, they're afraid of Kaipora, but it's not so much linked to kind of, as I guess our kind of neat research proposal suggested, to sustainable resource use, right? That may be because it's a community that's in very quick social change. It's an Afro-Brazilian community with indigenous influence, but they've become Catholic a long time ago. They've become majority evangelical since a couple decades. So some of these functions may be lost, right? And some of the older people are still aware of Kaipora's presence and sometimes afraid of Kaipora without it having that community function that it used to have. But it may also be that it's just too convenient of a story, this thing of like, here's an alternative ontology that kind of grounds a kind of indigenous sustainability that Western researchers like to refer to, right? So more research needed on that. Okay. That was just kind of to give you a sense both of what it means to think about different worlds and worldviews, and how to empirically study. In the first case, very kind of quantitatively, and in the second case, very kind of ethnographically in the communities that we've worked in. Now, moving towards the third part, how am I doing? Fine, I think. Of transdisciplinary negotiation. So in the beginning, those were really kind of the questions that at least I started with, right? I was trained as a philosopher. I was kind of thinking about epistemic diversity and ontological diversity back in the libraries of Columbia University or Humboldt, where I did my PhD. And at some point I was like, what am I doing if I don't engage with actual empirical material, right? I need to kind of do these things together in the field, right? But then in the beginning, intellectually, I was still thinking of it through my philosophical training, right? I wanted basically primary data to help me address my philosophical questions, right? And then you start working with the community, so that's our research team, and the research team, and you kind of get involved in people's struggles, right? And you kind of notice how a lot of these questions are so much entangled with kind of the future that the community has, the daily livelihood struggles that people have, right? And at some point, all these kind of very abstract philosophical questions, they become, I guess, less interesting, or they seem less pressing, right? And you wonder more about, like, okay, what am I doing here, right? Why do they have a German philosopher in the community talking about ontologies, right? What's the point, right? And I mean, there are different things that you can do in that situation, right? But I guess one of the motivation of us turning towards more empirical work while doing philosophy was the idea that maybe philosophers can be useful in some ways, right? Maybe one of the things we need to figure out is how can we navigate between these different worlds, right? How can we navigate between different forms of knowledge, because between radically different values, but also, of course, values and knowledges that are not only different, that also overlap enough for people to actually sometimes be able to have a constructive dialogue and to understand each other, right? Those things are complex. And when I work in Wageningen, and it's a very life sciencey place, right? I talk with the life scientists there. Often they have no idea, right, of how to bring together their methods, their way of thinking with the communities they work with, right? And that's why you have all this type of like dysfunctional development and conservation work that kind of imposes on the communities solutions that make things just worse, right? So there seems to be a need then of figuring out how to navigate places of ontological diversity, right? And that becomes something where I think a lot of our project has turned towards. Right. And so, how many laptops? And so at the core, then, transdisciplinarity means, I think, I mean, it's one of these buzzwords that's used in a million different ways, right? But the way how we use it is, I think it's quite simple, right? Interdisciplinarity means in these kind of domains to bring different academic disciplines together, right? So when it comes to, for example, biodiversity conservation or fishery or agriculture, things like that, right? Usually it's not enough to only engage with geneticists or only engage with economists or only engage with soil scientists or whatever, right? You need to bring different scientists from both natural social sciences together, maybe even humanities and philosophy, to kind of get things done in a better way, right? And then transdisciplinarity is that additional step of not only bringing academics together, right? But bringing academics together with other actors who also have relevant expertise, right? And that could be a community elder, that could be a farmer, that could be a fisher, that could be a policymaker, it could be a teacher, it could be a local business person, it could be a union leader, it could be a social movement, whatever, right? And so that brings up new methodological, practical, intellectual challenges, but at the same time, it also promises, I think, two things, right? One is what we call like the epistemic promise of transdisciplinarity, like the idea that if we bring different forms of expertise from inside and outside of academia together, we're going to be able to intervene in more effective and robust ways, right? So in Slovenia, for example, it's one of the best preserved mangrove forests along the Atlantic coast in Brazil, but incredibly vulnerable environment, right? How do you conserve that mangrove environment? Well, if you only have researchers from Salvador, from Sao Paulo, whatever, coming there telling them what to do, you will miss out on the local expertise. And often it's the fishers who've been there in the forest every day for 30, 40, 50 years, right? Who know about the local dynamics much better than the scientist who comes from the outside. Right? So then the problem, like the epistemic promises, right? You have the fisher who is an expert, for example, on detecting local ecosystem dynamics or kind of being able to very early recognize if a certain population, fish population declines, right? And because they're fishing every day. And you have the expertise of the, let's say, the ecologist from Sao Paulo, who let's say has fancy mathematical models to kind of do kind of modeling of how some of the dynamics will develop. You bring them together, they will be more effectively and robustly able to come up with a conservation plan than if only one of them does it by themselves, right? So that's kind of the epistemic part. And then the political promise is, it's not just about making things more effective and robust, right? It's also about making things more equal and just. Especially, I think, with transdisciplinary projects in Latin America, but also many other global South contexts. Often the idea is to bring people into decision-making processes who've been excluded from it, right? And so Sabina, Afro-Brazilian community, one of the poorest parts of one of the poorest states in Brazil, very few people in the community had the opportunity to get a university education. I don't think anyone in the community had an academic career, right? So if you only rely on academic researchers, of course you're reproducing a lot of the societal inequalities, right? So for example, Brazilian academia, honestly, it's quite white and quite middle class, and the community is mostly Black and it's mostly working class, right? And so the idea then is to not only bring different forms of expertise together to make things more efficient and robust, right? But to bring people into the conversation with an included from it, right? And by bringing their knowledge into it, also bringing, of course, their material interests, their values, and their ways of seeing the world into the conversation. Great. Now, NGOs, we've been doing that across a variety of contexts. So I'm just focusing for the sake of not babbling forever on the Brazil part, like the Brazilian team on top, where we've done similar things with the Center for Indigenous Knowledge and Organizational Development in Ghana. And on the bottom right, you see our Mexican team, Oaxaca. And in all of these cases, the idea is to figure out how we navigate that diversity in practice to actually fulfill those epistemic and political promises, because it turns out that often doing community-based research, it's incredibly difficult, right? And I think often transdisciplinarity it tells good stories, and it's incredibly difficult to pull off in practice. And we have more stories to tell, to be honest, about our failures than about our successes. And I think that's not for a lack of trying or for a lack of reflexivity or for a lack of serious commitment, but because it's incredibly difficult. But that doesn't mean that you fail with everything, right? And so I'm just gonna highlight two ways in how this can be kind of translated into practice. One more on the policy side, where as you saw earlier, we started very quantitatively with the fish, and that was actually not a bad idea, because that kind of allowed us also to intervene into some very kind of specific fishing-oriented areas, including policymaking. And so one of the areas that we noticed is there's this period called the defeso in Brazil, which is a period where the fishes are not allowed to fish, right? And so that's typically a few weeks out of the year to protect the fish while they lay the eggs, right? So then the idea is you don't catch and kill the fish while they're kind of reproducing, and once they've hatched and the eggs are laid, you can start fishing again, right? And that kind of maintains the population in a sustainable way. turns out, for us kind of taking local fishers' knowledge seriously, that the Brazilian law protects a fish simply at the wrong time, right? And so that's kind of the yellow, the red parts here are the ones that that the law says the fishers are not to allow certain species. You can see the species here. And then those are the responses by the fishers of when they actually find the eggs. Right? And it's complete mess because like the times when the species are protected are not the ones when the fishers find the eggs. So either they have to break the law by actually, stopping to fish at the points where they actually find the eggs, right, and continue to fish at the other times, although they follow the law, but they're kind of part of destroying the environment, right? So here, including the local knowledge and the local epistemologies and trying to co-produce would be quite clearly be beneficial for the fishers, for the environment, and so on. But it's, of course, not happening because the fishers are not recognized as experts in their own right. And Brazil has a very kind of technocratic governance culture. Other parts where we're trying to bring these things in as kind of intercultural education. So this is kind of a educational comic that that we kind of co-created with the kids and the teachers at the community. So it says the knowledges of the fishers, the knowledges of the school, the cycle of the Masonim, which is that shellfish that you see there. And so that integrates a lot of the local knowledge and the local cultural traditions around that specific species, with introducing scientific concepts, including climate change, saline content, and so on. On the one hand, communicating modern biological knowledge, as well as traditional fishers knowledge together in the school, and seeing how they can kind of be brought together for community action. And so that's kind of at the end of the story is the students do a protest and things like that. Good. So those are the kind of things in which you can appeal to different forms of knowing. You can include different ways of, for example, conceptualizing the environment, different cultural traditions, different ways of viewing the world and being in the world, in a way that you can have a productive dialogue. And you can do something like creating better educational materials or better policies that actually benefit the community. At least that's the hope, right? Because there are some things, and for example, I love our little here comic educational material, right? But trying to actually kind of do things together in a way that it creates structural change, I think, we're still often quite far away from that, and we've worked in that community for like 10 years now. So it's a long process in terms of kind of having an impact. Right, so I should probably come to an end soon. I wanted to kind of pivot back to abstract stuff, to philosophy, and just kind of present to you a little bit like a schematized conversation we had in our group over recent years that kind of goes back and forth between some people talking about different worlds and other people talking about different worldviews and that. And maybe you can just help us to solve that, right? So, let's move forward. So, a lot of the literature on that, like for the people who are like part of the academic debates on that, like the ontological turn, for example, people love to talk about different worlds. They love to talk about a pluriverse, a world in which different worlds fit. And they're often very explicit about that. It's not just about different worldviews, but it's really about different worlds, right? Now, I've been trained as not an anthropologist, but kind of more of a dry philosopher of science, right? And some people in our team have been similarly trained in that. And so then often the reaction to that is kind of, well, that's kind of obscure, right? To claim that there are different worlds. And so I think one of the reactions, not just by me, but some other people in the team we often had towards that talk was that clearly these transdisciplinary projects, they engage with different forms of knowledge about the world, right? They engage with different ways of viewing the world, but clearly they're still engaging with the same world, right? It's part of why people can collaborate, because they live in the same world, and they're just viewing it differently. Right? So that's one way of seeing it, right? And then some people in our team were more sympathetic towards a kind of ontological turn and the anthropological line, or more post-structuralists. They're like, well, look at our data, right? So the idea that there is one world that has one fundamental kind of way how it really is, and then we're just kind of looking at it differently, that clearly is challenged by our results, because as you can see, for example, in the case of our different fish taxonomies, there is not one fundamental description of how the biological world really is structured, but depending on what type of interests you have, you're going to come up with very different concepts, very different ways of constructing the world around you, right? So that's why, for example, the names and the classifications of fish in the community are very different than the names and classifications of the academic biologists, right? And that's in a way, for those who, for example, are familiar with more the anthropological history of that, it's not so different from, those classical examples of different names of snow and things like that, right? Where you have like different categorizations across different cultures, and kind of the challenge to the realist, there is not one fundamental way how the world really is, right? But then, of course, kind of the realists will not be satisfied with that, right? They will be, well, sure, there are different ways of describing the world, right? And maybe you're right that there's not one fundamentally correct way of describing how the world really is, but it's still different descriptions of the same world. Stop talking about different worlds, right? It's just different descriptions of the same world, right? And then we had some of the projects, like around Hypoda, for example, that kind of ended up having kind of more of, philosophically speaking, like a phenomenological, right? Where kind of the point was, well, sure, in the case of fish, and that's what I said earlier, right? You can kind of make sense of, there are those, the shared reality, the fish that are in the net, right? And then we have different descriptions of that same reality. In the case of Hypoda, it's quite difficult because there is no Hypoda in the net, right? It's not clear what people refer to when they talk about Hypoda. It's not so much clear that there is kind of a shared entity, right? That you say, oh, this is how the scientist refers to it, this is how the community refers to it. So how do we make sense of that? And then some people in our team were more inspired by phenomenological methods, right? And they're like, well, look, you need to kind of move away from this thing of trying to figure out the shared referent in the world. Instead, you need to kind of recognize that kind of different worlds appear for different people depending on their practices, right? And yeah, that makes quite a bit of sense. But then, realists can be stubborn, right? And for them, they'll be, well, yeah, sure, there are different experiences, but stop confusing different experiences or different conceptualizations or whatever else of the world with different worlds. Just because you're experiencing the world differently doesn't mean that they're different worlds, right? Maybe, right? There are others, and I'm kind of more actually sympathetic to also that argument, to say, well, talk about different worlds in this kind of ontological term context. It's not just about people conceptualizing or experiencing the world differently, right? It's also about them creating different material worlds around them, right? It's not just about our kind of like the constructivist idea that we're kind of linguistically creating different worlds. We're very materially creating different worlds through different ways, for example, of engaging with the forest, right? If we cut it down, it's going to be a very different world than if we kind of live together with the forest, right? And a lot of these communities, they have practices of building worlds that are very different from the worlds of kind of us urban modern people, right? So that's also a way of thinking about different worlds. So it's not just different conceptualizations or experiences of the world, but different material practices of creating worlds around us. So yeah, that's kind of moving back from some of the more practical things of how do we organize transdisciplinary things, about us getting lost in philosophical arguments about what are we engaging here with? Is it different worlds? Is it different worldviews? I think I'm just going to end here so that we have some time for discussion, and you're very welcome to pick on any of the more applied or more philosophical parts of the talk. Thank you.
Let me see. We'll stop presenting. Ugh, is that not me? Okay, I'll stop presenting here. And show. Stop presenting. And for the microphone,
Sure.
the best is if you repeat the question if it comes from the audience.
I'll do that.
And I'll see, can people, all right, everybody both here and online. It's time for Q&A. So if you're online, raise your hand online and then I'll see you, and you can unmute yourself and talk. But perhaps we have a question already in the room. There's one from Hugo already. Go ahead.
Yep. Thanks. That was very interesting. And I wanted to ask, just a curiosity that I had about the concept of transdisciplinarity.
Mm-hmm.
So all the examples here are across disciplines, mostly across some scientific disciplines, where the practitioners are academics, and then some cases of the fishermen. Like my first thought when I think of experts working together, I'm not immediately thinking of scientists, right? And here all the cases are about scientists and the fishermen.
Right.
Is that intended? Is this supposed to be mostly a theory or theorizing academics working together with other knowledge producers, or could this also be academically educated people who go somewhere, you know?
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
I don't think it's limited to contexts that involve academic researchers at the core, right? I mean, you could think about the dynamics of, for example, companies and governance and citizens, right? Trying to sort things out. I do think, at least at the broadest level, right? I think transdisciplinary issues and the question of how do you relate different actors, different forms of expertise also happen outside of academic involvement. Of course, the dynamics become quite different, right? So I think if you have scientists involved, there are particular questions of epistemic authority that are quite different than if there's no scientist involved, right? Because often the scientists are supposed to be the ones who, you know, have kind of the truth trademarked, or right, are the ones who really know. So there may be different. I mean, it's not that, for example, if you have, let's say, like a project with companies and policymakers and communities, that there are no epistemic hierarchies, right? There may be still very paternalistic towards the community, right? But some of those dynamics will be different. Some of the political dynamics are quite different, right? If it's, for example, corporate involvement, it's much more about kind of straightforward commodification, which often involves different forms of political problems and resistance and scientific projects. So yeah, I think in general it's expandable, but I think for me as someone who's a philosopher of science who's kind of made a career out of studying scientists, I'm most comfortable in the areas where scientists are involved. Right? Yeah.
Further questions? Yes, Anna?
I have three, so maybe I'll just do one and then. So I'm gonna start from the back.
Yeah.
So when you were putting the types, the realist and the phenomenologist, the constructivist, and those were the three, right?
Yeah.
Yeah? Yeah. So I was thinking about like what I'm doing now with the integration of ontologies in policymaking in Europe. And I'm starting from a realist perspective of a unique material world, regardless of interpretations, because it's kind of the only way you can kind of get into that context. You cannot arrive to a policymaking context here in Europe and say, there's multiple worlds, right? So I'm thinking that there might be it might be interesting, or maybe your thoughts about a pragmatic use of this. So what particular approach, ontological approach, do we need to navigate these contexts now for specific problem solving? So do we need to consider the realist approach, or do we need, and to be able to navigate without a complex through the different types of perspectives? It's like, how do you see that playing out? For example, in the context where you were at, did you have to kind of navigate those for problem solving, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think I'm sympathetic towards being pragmatic about that, right? And so for example, there may be policy context. We're talking about different worlds. It just sounds too wacky, right? and then you kind of talk about like different views or whatever, right? And there may be other contexts where you talk more with social science, humanities types of people, where honestly talking about different worlds sounds theoretically more exciting and sexy than worldview stuff. So it's a bit old-fashioned sometimes, And then in other contexts, like it may go one way or another, right? And I don't mind people being kind of pragmatic about it. At the same time, I think, that reflects that, for you, I think what you're truly passionate about is making a difference in practice, right? And those kind of theoretical things are more instrumental towards them. Well, for a lot of the philosophers I talk with, they're not going to be pragmatic about whether it's worlds or worldviews, right? That's like at the core of what they're interested about. And often it's also at the core of what they think it's important, right? So I think, for example, a lot of people in the more realist camp and analytically trained philosophers who get really upset about, the talk about different worlds because, they think cultural relativism is a threat, right? And it kind of reinforces kind of relativist attitudes, right? And the other way around, a lot of the ontological turn people, right, who are kind of so insistent that it's worlds, not worldviews, right? It's because they have kind of put this whole thing of, realism together with universalism and Western and modernity and all of that. So it's all part of the oppressor, right? So that becomes I think, a kind of existential ideological battle for a lot of these more theoretically oriented folks, whether you do that, whether it's worlds or worldviews, and then your pragmatism is not going to convince them, right? So it depends who you're going to talk with.
Oops. Do we have a question online so far? Yes, Irene. Hopefully we can hear you.
I'll try.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We have a small echo, so I'll keep it short. Your talk is very interesting. It reached me in Berlin, and I'm in education. I'm especially excited about the worldview approach. I'll be listening in again in April. But now I was wondering, what do you think about the significance of learning to believe something to be true? when you're in the field, do you imagine to believe in this entity of Kaipora? Can you learn to see that it is true? Can you switch in and out of worldviews? Is it a competence that we need for the future? This is like the idea I'm playing with.
Yeah, tricky one. Is that kind of the will to believe William James type of thing, or?
It's more the learning worldviews.
Right.
The construction of, like, you can talk with Piaget maybe, or just how can I learn a worldview? Can I change it? Can I switch back and forth between worldviews? Like I can imagine one philosophy or the other.
Yeah. I mean, I think, obviously we can learn worldviews, right? Because, depending on where we grow up, the environment that teaches us makes us have very different worldviews, right? So in a way, I think we have the obvious empirical evidence that we can learn worldviews, right? I don't think we can just kind of, and that's why I asked about the will to believe. I always found that very difficult. I never managed to kind of will just by pure wanting to believe something, right? So for me, I think it's more about learning practices, right? Rather than learning to take something to be true, right? Because I think if we don't have the practices around it, it becomes very difficult just as an intellectual exercise to just start believing a Kaipora, right? If you grow in a community where your practices involve Kaipora every day, anyway, right? It's very easy. And so I would say it's not so much about learning to take something to be true, right? It's about learning practices in which these entities are just kind of part of the reality, right? And so that makes sense to me. Well, I find it very difficult as a pure intellectual exercise to just kind of learn how to take something to be true if it's not connected to the practices. And I also think empirically that's kind of how it works, right? So we're, depending on which part of the world we grew up with and which cultural context, of course, we acquire different worldviews. But it's not just because we're kind of being disciplined into certain truth claims. It's more because we're just kind of living our life and our practices involve certain entities, right? Yeah.
Thank you. Elena had a question.
Hi. So yes, thank you very much for this talk. It was really interesting, and I also have a bunch of questions, but maybe in front of a glass of wine. One maybe if I choose one that is for me capture my interest really much is Kaipora being, and so it was very clear how you showed how the realist or quantitative approach wouldn't work that much or have some issues, and then you said that, there the phenomenologist, so to say, had its moment in some sense, saying, and I was wondering, do you think, since you mentioned it at the end, the new materialist also could be an interesting approach to think of this capoeira, or like beings that are escape the basic Western epistemology system, so to say. Yeah.
I was a bit hesitant to call it new materialist at the end, because it's also kind of an obscure intellectual tradition with like a lot of different strands, right? And so it depends on how you interpret it, right? So I think the wider interpretation of the material in the new materialism just means, the materiality of practices, basically, right? Then yes, right? Because then it's not just about people having phenomenologically the experience, and people say that, of course, that they've encountered Kaipora, they've heard Kaipora, they've seen them, they've been misled by them, right? But it's also then, that would be kind of the phenomenological take on it. That, well, I think new materialism in the broad sense, right, that appeals to materiality of practices, right? It's all the kind of fishing practices where you do go into the forest, where you don't go into the forest. All of these things are very real, right? And so, yeah, if you interpret Kaipoda through that, right? Exactly, right? Then I think in that interpretation, you could very easily apply to Kaipoda, right? If you take the materialist part a bit stronger, right? And you could still, of course, wonder, well, okay, so there are practices around the Kaipoda, but does Kaipoda themselves has a material reality, right? Because, for example, we can have practices, for example, around how we treat our friends, right? But our friends are also real as physical objects, right? And so, well, like, what do you make out of that material question, right? But yeah, I think in general, that kind of broadly practice-oriented, whether you call it new materialism or something else that involves our discourses, our experiences, but also our material practices, right? That I think that's a good way of giving richness to ontological divergence without getting lost in kind of arguments of whether it's really real or not, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I'll ask the question first because I've been meaning to ask the question for a while, which is the following. So in the way you presented things here, on the one hand, there's the community, and on the other hand, there's the scientific worldview, or there's the scientists, and there's a clash of worldviews, or there's maybe an incomprehension, maybe there's both compatibilities and incompatibilities between the two. My question is about scale, I guess. That is there a big clash between indigenous worldviews on the one hand and scientific worldviews on the other hand? Because at the same time, you said there's disagreement within the community. It's not clear that there's one worldview there, always there. And of course, we also know that scientists disagree with each other. Eugene Fleck in the 30s shows like when you're looking at a bacillus, if you ask a team that's working at the forefront of looking at the bacillus, they'll see one thing and they classify them in one way. If you ask medical practitioners who are treating diseases, they'll do a different classification, partly not just because they have different interests, but also because there's a certain community, but quite ephemeral, quite superficial community of thought. There's a style of thinking. They've learned to see it in a certain way. They keep innovating, finding new ways. People disagree. And in your community, you have people who become Christian and who learn to see these old spirits are not really spirits, but, fantasies or tricks of the devil. And so, so I think on both sides, is there really like two worldviews? Are there multiple worldviews interacting in each side? Is it, you see what I mean?
So it's a lot to say on that. But I think the most general answer is no, we don't assume that there is a divide between two different worlds. And in the book, for example, we have this extended critique of what we call meta-dualism, of authors, a lot of ontological turn authors, for example, who claim to be against dualistic philosophies, but then could hardly be more dualistic themselves when they make this very simple divide of, on the one hand, there's kind of the indigenous, emancipatory, holistic, sustainable, caring, and so on world, and on the other hand, there's a capitalistic, colonial, patriarchal, modern, Western, scientific, technological world, right? And then politics becomes interpreted as a clash between those two worlds. And sometimes that divide, I do think it has some political mobilizing power. But I think in terms of philosophical analysis and also ethnographic analysis and, and developing useful political strategies that are nuanced enough to take, for example, the realities of a community like Slovenia into account, it's often very harmful and misleading to make that divide. For example, by putting science and capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, blah, 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 all together in one bag, right, without being able to differentiate, it makes it conceptually unclear how there can be emancipatory science, right? Because science is already on one side of that divide, right? And so I think you see that also how that can backfire. And frankly, a lot of leftist social movement people, they're scared of science, right? And they're scared of numbers, and present the more quantitative stuff. People kind of don't engage with it because science is part of Western modernity and all its oppressive kind of essentially oppressive character, right? And then at the same time, it also I think really misrepresents communities. Right, so because it's a little bit the kind of often I feel it's kind of urban academics who are like disenchanted with their own modern world. We're kind of then romanticizing these communities as kind of the holistic other, right? And I mean, if you look into, for example, tourism and indigeneity and all of that, you can see a lot of the violence that produces, right? Of kind of how people are kept into these positions where they're supposed to kind of perform that otherness, right? Well, of course, in Sabina, the people they want better cell phone connection, right? And they do want their traditional fishing ways, but yeah, they use GPS for that now, right? And they're frustrated that they don't get the sanitation, that they don't get the infrastructures of modernity that's provided to other people. And so navigating that, both kind of the livelihoods and the material demands of communities, as well as the complexity of modernity and the way how it can be oppressive and emancipatory, requires, I think, much more than that simple divide of assuming that there are kind of two worlds that are clashing with each other.
Thank you. There was a question over here, and then you. This is a question here.
Thank you for your very interesting presentation. I was wondering regarding the more participatory action research transdisciplinary approach. Like, since you were a very big team, I don't know of what people it consists, but was like what role played maybe also the academic culture regarding those approaches? Like, because I know that there's quite a difference, for example, in Brazil is way more political. I don't know, the academic institution, whereas often, I don't know, at least in Germany, you have more this way, you have to stay neutral and so on. So I was wondering what was the influence there maybe on your research and how it also evolved into this project.
Yeah, for sure.
So, I mean, there's a lot that could be said on influence of academic culture in general, Dutch academic culture, Brazilian academic culture, the different influences. I guess the most striking influence, I would say, in all of that was the fact of how much a PhD, and especially a PhD in Wageningen, disciplines people into doing certain things and not allows them to do other things, right? The way how, but I do think that's true also for Brazil, the way how PhD trajectories are envisioned are fundamentally incompatible with transdisciplinary work. One's going to give you a PhD fellowship if you say, I'm not going to define a research question because first I want to spend a year in the community to figure out what they want to ask, right? So PhD trajectories are linear, while transdisciplinary work should be circular. Also, Dutch universities and Wageningen in particular is a very corporate place. For journal papers, right? In Q1 journals for your dissertation, you have 4 years, go, right? And then, yeah, of course, that creates the kind of contradiction. So if you go there, you want to do something that's meaningful for the community, right? But you need to collect the data to publish your 4 papers, and funding is running out. You need to write the project report soon, right? So yeah, of course, a lot of the academic cultures and the way how academia is set up, the way how PhDs are set up, they're very much disciplined what you can or can't do, and it's often, let's say, not favorable to the ideas of participatory action and such. Yeah.
Right. Todd had a question.
Yeah. Thanks, David. It's a great talk. Great to learn more about your research. I was thinking a little bit about the religious dimension of worldviews and ontologies, and it seemed that you can make a clear case for the democratization of knowledge and intercultural exchange when it's talking about fish and breeding of fish and so on. I can understand that there's it's easy to see a happy coexistence of 2 ontologies at this very base level of reality and so on. But when you get to the physics, and once you get to the metaphysics, and then you move higher up into the metaphysical, it then becomes more difficult. So we had the question from Irena about this kaipora, right? Could you yourself, you could understand the difference in the fish categorization probably, but can you really actually understand kaipora or really get into it? And then it's a bit the question like, okay, and on the low level, I understand how you have democratization of knowledge, but on the high level, how do you do it? And because worldview, the attractiveness of worldview or ontology, frankly, is always this higher metaphysical level, and the idea of totality as organized from metaphysics and not the other way around. I was just thinking, I don't know if you'd find this interesting, but there was this Benjamin Whorf. He has this essay where he's talking about essentially the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and he brings up worldview, and he's talking about, I don't know, the Navajo language providing a worldview, and he talks about scientific worldview in the context of that, because you're coming from that background, right? Thinking about the scientific worldview interacting with the local worldview in the ethnographic encounter. And he said that the scientific worldview had the same problems as the Navajo worldview in a sort of incommensurability issue, that the scientists are locked in their own worldview. They couldn't absolutely understand the Navajo worldview, but they did have a kind of added benefit of some other type of representation that they were capable of that would allow them to somehow represent the Navajo. The question then applied to your research, like, well, first of all, do you feel that you can adequately represent kaipora? And on the other way around, do you feel that the people you interact with can conceptualize your metaphysics? If there is actually a difference on the higher level, or not?
So,
Yeah.
So I think there are different parts to that. One is that I do think we can understand other communities than our own to certain degrees, for sure, right? And that's also reciprocal, right? So when you said Whorf, I think the one thing I would be skeptical of that's somehow a unique ability of scientists, right? So I mean, I think indigenous communities or whoever who interacts with scientists, they can also learn how to make sense of what the scientists are doing, right? So we're doing intercultural translation in other direction. And sometimes that translation is not as difficult as some of the ontological turn people or some of the kind of, Sapir-Whorf theory type of anthropologists want us to make believe, right? And I think these types of, for example, the fish example, I think they're kind of pointing you in that direction. I think one thing that you learn when working on issues like conservation management with communities over years, scientists and communities, they develop a lot of mutual understanding, right? And they can start to respect each other as experts. They can start to understand each other's concepts, even if these concepts don't have direct translations into their own languages, right? So I do think intercultural dialogue and understanding reaches further than some of the literature on kind of radical authority wants to make us believe. I don't think everything is incommensurable, for example, in these contexts. At the same time, I also don't think everything is commensurate, right? And so Kaipoda, I think, is one of those cases that became quite central to us because it kind of really showed those limitations, right? As long as we were kind of working at this kind of more fine-grained level of different biological classifications, we could always have some kind of translation scheme, right? Well, if you look at those properties, like the color of the fish or how they taste or whatever, of course you classify them that way. If you look at the genetics, the phylogenetics, you classify them that way. Very easy. In Kaipoda, it's very confusing. And so no, I would not pretend at all that I can relate to Kaipoda in a way that someone in the community can, right? What's less clear to me, one of the most hard-nosed PhDs in our project, though, she did her master in logic at the UFA, and then we got her to do fieldwork there on Kaipoda. And then she actually kind of experienced Kaipoda, right? So you can have that experience. And she's like as secular as someone can be, and so that was kind of a shock, mostly for herself. but so I just think you can have those kind of experiences for sure. But then I don't think it's just about the experiences, right? And I think that leads back to your question on the practices and the kind of materiality of them. If you think about different ontologies through the kind of embedded practices of everyday life, right? Of course, I'm a German philosopher of science whose daily reality and practices are incredibly different from like a local fisher in Bahia, right? And so maybe if I would, give up on my current identity and I would move to Sardinia and I would live there for 30 years, I would adopt the practices and fish every day in the mangroves. And maybe I could relate to Kaipoda in a similar way, right? Maybe it's already too late. But yeah, I think if you take that practice aspect of ontology seriously, then it's not just about intellectually shifting things, right? It's about transforming the material realities you live in, and because you can't live in all material realities at the same time, you can't have all ontologies at the same time, I would say.
All right, do we have some more questions online? No, Inga? Yes, go ahead. You can unmute.
Yes. Thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering about the methods that you would apply when you talk about intercultural dialogue. So, for example, I'm thinking a lot of like Maria Lugones and her vision of the world traveling, or these accounts of, in order that there are dialogues making it possible to come to emerge different logics of the same story. So at the end, you get like this full picture of hopefully an encounter and an understanding of each other. So I was wondering in how much your project is also contributing to these like philosophical methodological framework of discovering what does a dialogue need, and so in the end it reflects back to our human condition. How do we as humans interact?
Right. Yeah, I think that's become a huge part of the project in its later years, and I think that reflects also the kind of the shift that, you know, my story that I read in the beginning was about. In the beginning, the methods we were thinking about were more methods of empirical philosophy, right? How do you study ontologies? Which is quite different from the methods that you need to facilitate dialogues, right? And then, I mean, we work a lot with the schools. A lot of the methods came through debates about intercultural education, and especially rural education. And then it's mostly because at least the Sardinia project's in Brazil, and so most of the researchers are Brazilians. Of course, you can't be a kind of leftist Brazilian researcher working in education without like being deeply influenced by Paulo Freire. So that's kind of like the starting point of a lot of that, in terms of kind of thinking about emancipatory dialogues, about developing critical consciousness through collaboration of, you know, people in different positions of power and all of that. And so a couple of the Brazilian PhDs who worked in the community, they like several of their papers are methods papers, right, where they try to develop new methods, like one thing that they call the Council of Care, for example, which is kind of an arts-based method of drawing from like the kind of other things like the theater of the oppressed and the parliament of things, kind of the idea of developing methods where you can develop new relations of care by kind of role-playing what it would be to be the mangroves, what it would be to be the crabs in the mangroves, and so on, right? So there are all kinds of new methods that people develop then to kind of facilitate new dialogues that kind of allow you to kind of navigate between different worldviews and translating them into practice. So. But it's also very tricky, right? So I would suggest that we kind of have figured out the methods for that, right? We're kind of mostly trying things out and getting lost.
Great. Thank you very much, David. This is us for today. We're going to go for drinks now. Thank you very much for the people online who stuck with us in spite of the technical difficulties. On I believe the 4th of April is our next seminar. I'll send an email around and we'll have the date and all of this to talk about religious education, or education now about the diversity of worldviews. And it will be a round table, so it's like a different format. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Anyone wants to come along for coffee or beer or something? Probably we should just go to Buffalo. Sadly, we went there yesterday, but it's pouring rain, and it's right next door.
Great.
It's pouring. You have a big umbrella.
You see it?
Yeah.
Oh, like, from here you can't see the